Welcome to Biblical Demand, and today is the season 2 and the episode 1 with Dr. Joshua Rasmussen, who's a professor of philosophy at Azusa Pacific University. He works in analytic metaphysics with a focus on basic categories of reality, such as objects, ideas, and necessary existence. He is the author of several books, including Defending the Correspondence Theory of Truth, Necessary Existence, How Reason Can Lead to God, and Is God the Best Explanation of Things, and his forthcoming book, Who Are You Really? He is also the founder of the Worldview Design Training Center, which helps people use reason to address the big questions of life. It's my joy to have you, Dr. Joshua, on my podcast.
Thank you. It's an honor to be with you.
Welcome. So let's begin with your story. Tell us your story about yourself. That how did you come to know Jesus, especially
Mhm.
Jesus?
Yeah. My family is, my dad is actually a pastor. And when I was growing up, there was just a healthy spirituality. Um, the idea of being connected to God was something that I heard about at an early age. And so I remember one time just thinking about wanting to be good. And I talked to my mom about wanting to be good. And she sat with me and invited me. She said we could pray about it. And so we did. And I remember the prayer. I remember inviting specifically Jesus to come into my life to make me into the kind of person that he would want me to be. And it's funny because for me, as a young child, I just remember having this shift of desire to be responsible for cleaning my room. Like before that, I didn't want to clean my room. It didn't matter that my parents wanted my room clean, but this might sound kind of silly, but I just remember having this feeling like, oh, I want to, honor my parents and have my room clean. So that was really the beginning of my journey there. And then later in my life, when I was a senior in high school, I began to discover many other worldviews, many other perspectives. You were telling me before the show about your own journey and just that there's many different philosophies, many different worldviews. And this caused me to really rethink the foundations of the worldview that I had inherited. And I had lots of questions, and this sent me on a journey. Now, and I remember laying in bed one afternoon, looking up at my ceiling fan, feeling worried about the end of life. And I remember thinking, there's two options. Either when I die, I'll have my last act of awareness followed by nothing forever and ever and ever. Like there'll never be another act of awareness. Or I'll continue to be aware in some form. Those are the two options. And I remember thinking, well, I would like it to be the case that I could be able to continue to be aware, at least if it's in a positive state of awareness. I remember thinking that. But I also remember thinking, I can't just believe something because I want to believe it, just because I think it would be nice. In fact, the very fact that I might want to believe it even made me a little bit worried that, well, maybe this is a belief that appeals to me because I want to believe it. And at that time, I just was honest with myself and thought, I really don't know which way reality is. I don't know whether there's life after death. I don't know whether God is real. I just don't know. So this led me to really seek to find out more information. I went to the library, read lots of books, and began to, in a sense, kind of make my worldview my own. So it wasn't just inherited from my parents. And my parents, they always instilled within me the value of seeking truth and seeking understanding, seeking wisdom. And so they supported me in this journey, and they gave me resources. And so that was kind of the next step of my journey. And then maybe one more iteration would be me coming back to a belief in God, although a belief in God where God is bigger than I imagined. He's not reducible to the particulars of perhaps how I was thinking of him as a child, but that he sort of transcends. God's not human, he's not like a superhuman. He's a spiritual being. He relates to us perhaps in ways we can understand. You mentioned Jesus taking on a human form so we can understand him through that form, but he's not himself fundamentally human. I've thought about this in terms of how God might relate to butterflies. It's like butterflies might imagine God as a butterfly or something, but of course, God's not a butterfly, right? God relates to all the different beings. And so as I studied philosophy and science, a belief in God was restored, but it was a belief in a bigger God, a more inclusive or more universal God than I had kind of previously imagined. So those are a few highlights in my story.
Wow, it's so wonderful to hear that you had some questions about your existence and around the world around you, and God used those questions to lead you to the bigger journey, and He
Hmm.
introduced Himself to you, who He is, as you mentioned that Jesus came in a human form so that we may understand as humans, but God is not fundamentally human. So
Yeah,
that's really nice to hear that. So moving on to this question, that as believers, as Christian believers and Bible believers, we know and convinced that God does exist, and even the book of Romans says that God has revealed Himself through conscience and nature.
yeah,
And so let's talk about those people who do not have an access to the Bible. And so apart from the Bible, how do we know God exists?
yeah. My first thought when I saw this question, how do we know? I want to flag that word we, and I want to say, well, it depends on who is included in the we. And the reason for this is that I really believe that God relates to different people according to their uniqueness. You know, we mentioned butterflies. Well, God would relate to butterflies according to butterflies. God would relate to humans according to humans. And different humans are different, and different things appeal to different humans. I do think there are general marks within creation, within conscience, as you mentioned, that would point to God in a universal way. But I find that different people will kind of align more with certain particulars than others. Like, for example, scientists will look for more empirical evidence. So they'll be looking at maybe the fine tuning of the universe for life, and that might appeal to them. As a philosopher, I like tracks of reason. I like to see, okay, well, is there a path of just pure reason? Can we deduce, perhaps just thinking about the ultimate nature of an uncaused fundamental reality, from there that it would have a kind of supreme nature? So I really think that there are different paths for different people. Perhaps the most general answer would be something like what you suggested, generally from creation, from conscience, or from elements of consciousness more generally within. I think that you can see, you can experience the light of God's voice inside. But I want to emphasize that I do think God relates to people in different ways according to their unique journey.
Yeah, I think absolutely right that God connects with people differently, as you mentioned. That the scientists would go for empirical evidences, and philosophy
Yeah.
would go for the reasoning. And but ultimately, it both comes down to the conscience and nature, right? As the Book of Romans says.
Yeah, it's interesting. At least that, right? I mean, um, I don't. I would actually want to think about all the different categories in terms of that. Are there categories outside of conscience? That's why I mentioned consciousness. I've been working on this book on consciousness. Well, conscience you might think of as a certain type of consciousness that uh, detects right and wrong, and there that might be sort of a window into God's heart. Um, but there's also this interesting argument just from consciousness more generally. Now, you might think consciousness is part of creation, so it's still generally an argument from creation. So, yeah, maybe all the arguments, maybe all the reasons and all the pathways come from those two. To be honest, I'd have to think more about that. That's not a question. Nobody's ever asked me that specific question, so that's one I'd like to think more about. But at least through those paths, yes, I think that's right.
Yeah, correct. So yeah, so we can know God. I mean, though we do not have Bible, for example, people doesn't have Bible in the tribal areas and rural areas. Still, they can sense something, some immaterial world consciousness. You mentioned consciousness and other concepts which may lead them to the truth. But so moving on to this question, that if, for example, now we have found out that God does exist, right? Now we know that God does exist, and second step would be to know Him more deeply. And as a seeker, I must look to the historical religious scriptures, right?
Mm-hmm.
So those who talk about Him, those who describe Him. So since there are numerous religions and their scriptures, and also the Bible claims there is one God and He's Jesus. So if God exists, then is the Bible only scripture who describes Him?
What's interesting, that word scripture literally means writing. And so, there is that text that all scripture is God breathed from Paul. But then that very term there means writing. So then the question is, this is a great question you're asking, is what writings describe God? Well, I mean, I've written a book about God. Do some of my writings describe God? Now you might think that that book doesn't carry the same weight or the same authority as, let's say, the biblical texts. My view on this is I kind of have just this general principle that any text that God inspires is going to carry authority because God himself is inspiring it. And so the question that you're asking reduces to the question, which texts has God inspired, right? And I believe that God has inspired various texts. I think that this is something that one has to look personally at the particular text, see if it has the earmarks of coming from God, looking at the character of God. Because, if I just tell you, well, it's all in the Bible, that's not necessarily going to help somebody who doesn't believe in the Bible. Or if I say it's the texts that are written over here on some rock, well, that's not going to help somebody who doesn't believe in, that rock. So what are some general principles that somebody can use to empower them in their search? And one of the things that I think about as a philosopher is, well, does the text match the character of God? This is why I think it is difficult to divide biblical revelation from reasoning or from conscience, as you mentioned, or from creation, because if there's an inconsistency between what a text is claiming and what you can understand from conscience and from creation, then that's a good reason I think that text wouldn't be from a divine being. So I think it's very helpful to kind of have this as a principle to think about, like, well, does this text accord with the heart of God? That's not the only consideration. You also want to look at the historical evidence surrounding the texts, how it was formed. So there are a number of different factors to consider. But that's kind of what I would want to offer as an answer, is more general principles so people can apply those principles in their own journey to investigate.
Yeah, absolutely. So uh, you're saying that a person should have one general view of God, and if on the other hand Bible, on the other hand we have Bible, so we can compare those character of God and those nature of God and those characters of God with the Bible, as you said that also that historically we can also look to those evidences about God. Let's say God is love. Bible talks about God is love. That is one of his character, right? So throughout the history, we have seen the character of God being loving and being kind to the Israelite, now to the Gentiles as well. Is that right?
Yes, that's how I would see it. And then that opens up questions, right? Because you can look at different passages. There are different ways of interpreting those passages. And there are debates about whether certain interpretations would align with the heart of God. But then you can use the heart of God as a kind of even interpretive lens, as well as I said, a filter for discerning which texts may actually be better representatives of God than other texts.
Mm, absolutely. So, moving on to this philosophical question, as we have discussed till now, that how do we know God exists, and is the Bible only scripture who describes him? And as a rational being, I would always love to walk in truth, just because I know there is truth and false, right?
Mm-hmm.
So both exist. I know my mother loves him. That is the truth. That is a reality for me, because over the period of time, I've experienced her love when I was in a tough situation. I was going through some really bad times. So, uh, so is there any criteria or process to know something is true?
Most fundamentally, I would say experience. Now, I use this term experience in the broadest sense. So it includes your experience with God, if you have a sense of connection with God. It will include your experience with abstract relations within logic. For example, you might have the experience that if you add up two numbers, if you take 2 plus 2 and you add them up, then they will add up to the number 4. And this is kind of a mental experience that you have in your mind, that that's true. Or that 5 plus 5 equals 29. Your mind says false to that. That's a kind of mental experience. You can have experience with grass, and this gives you evidence of grass. There are questions about the external world. Why think that your conscious experience of grass actually represents or is connected to real grass outside of your head? Well, I mean, there are different views on this, but in my view, there is an argument from the best explanation of your experiences. So you have internal experiences that you access directly. Then you also have an experience with different hypotheses better explaining your conscious experiences than others. And through the experience of some hypotheses better explaining your experiences, you can then arrive at a kind of probabilistic inference to think that, for example, there's grass external to your mind. The point here is that if you think of experience in a broad way, then to get to truth involves expanding your experiences. This can amount to making more observations. This can amount to having more experience with analysis of things that you've already observed, but you're experiencing the analysis, you're turning it over in your mind. This can include experience with reading scriptures, for example. If you have experiences that testify that these things are inspired by God, and then the scriptures say specific things about God's love for you, then that will also give you a guide to truth. So ultimately, I think it's going to depend on your experiences. Now, that's a very general answer. If it's difficult to get more specific, I mean, this is one of the general problems in philosophy, is like, what's the general criterion by which you can know what's true? And if you get more specific, if you say, well, in order to know what's true, you have to be able to deduce it from your 5 empirical senses, or through some canon of logical axioms that we've written down and recorded, then we've cut ourselves off from seeing many truths. In fact, we've even cut ourselves off from seeing the truth of that very criteria. So it's difficult really to come up with more specific criteria. But I do want to add one more thing here, if I may. I think that even more important than understanding a set of criteria to get to truth is to understand what kind of attitudes help you to get to truth. And I think that intellectual virtues, having intellectual humility, being curious, wanting to get to truth, wanting truth is fundamentally, I think, one of the most important attitudes to get to truth. And that's a personal thing that you can check within. Like, am I actually trying to get to truth here? Or am I trying to instead maybe make myself look significant? Am I trying to show that my opponent is wrong? Am I trying to protect my ego? There are many things that we can pursue. But if we could become curious and we think, I really want to know what's true here, that I think is a very powerful attitude that will position you to see more truth.
Yeah. So basically, the experience you're mentioning, that the experience can lead to the truth. Certain experience in a broader sense.
So, in the broadest sense, yeah, I do want to emphasize in the broadest sense. That's why I mentioned experience with mathematical truths, experiences with God, experiences with reading the Bible. So it's experience in the broadest sense. Some people might hear me say experience, and they might say, "Oh, you're restricting yourself too much." And it's like, well, I don't just mean your 5 empirical senses, your seeing, your tasting. I mean all of your senses, including the sense of reason, the sense of right and wrong, the sense of logic, and these sorts of things.
So here comes the one more question that once we know the truth can be subjective or objective. How do you respond that philosophically?
So what is objective, right? So objective, one way of defining objective is that it exists, or it is the case, independently of a person or a subject thinking about it. Okay, an example would be the earth is spherical, okay, or the earth is not made out of cheese. So there's no controversy. I've never heard of any human being who's even questioning that. So I'm going to use that as my example. The earth is made of cheese completely through and through, right? The idea here is that even if we all believe that the earth is made of cheese, the truth of the matter is about how the actual earth is. There's an objectivity to that. Okay, so in that sense, I do think truth is objective, because truth is about how actual reality is, independently of what we believe it to be. On the other hand, I do think that there's a subjectivity in our search for truth, because we are subjects seeing reality through our own windows, through our own senses, and senses are subjective elements. So I do think there's a way in which both go together. We are subjective beings seeking the truth from a subjective perspective, but the truth we're seeking is objective. It's really there. And I think that's also humbling too, because it helps you to realize I can get it wrong. Even if my subjective experience makes it so that's rational for me to believe something, that doesn't mean that it's actually true. And when I realize being rational is not enough to have the truth, then it humbles me. It helps me to seek more, to get more information. I do think it's possible, because somebody might be listening to this and they might be worried about skepticism. They might think, well, if your only access to the truth is through these subjective windows, through your senses, how can you ever know that you've arrived at the truth? How can you have any security? Well, I think that there are cases where you have direct awareness. For example, right now I have this direct awareness of talking with you. I have this experience of talking with you. Now, maybe behind my computer screen, it's just a massive trick. It's machines that are stimulating my computer. Like, you're not actually there. You don't actually exist. But at least I know that I'm experiencing a computer screen. And that's something, that's a bit of knowledge. And then going back to what I said before about best explanations, I think that I can know that some explanations are better than others. And so this gets us started. It doesn't solve every skeptical question somebody might have, but it does, I think, help us to see that you can have subjective awareness that's direct of objective reality.
Correct.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I get you, but so you're saying that subjectivity, a subjective truth and objective truth, both goes hand in hand, right?
You can have objective truth and a subjective awareness of that truth, is what I would say. Yes.
Correct. So, and that's really for me too hard to digest, to just program into my mind, because that is purely philosophical to me. So
That's difficult. And also, I do want to say, some people use the term truth in a sort of subjective way. I think what they mean by that, if they say, I've got my truth, you've got your truth, I think what they're saying is, I've got my perspective, you have your perspective.
correct.
But then there can be a reality outside of our perspectives. For example, is the total number of cats even, or is the total number of cats odd? Well, I don't think anybody has counted the cats. I mean, apart from God, right? It's not part of my perspective if there's an even number of cats. It's not part of your perspective. But the idea is that, well, either it is even or it is odd. One of those has to be true, because otherwise you have a contradiction. If you say it's both even and odd, that can't be right. Or neither even or odd, that it's also contradictory. So in order to avoid the contradiction, the truth has to be that it's either even or it's actually odd,
Yes.
even if we have no idea subjectively from our own perspective.
Mhm. Yeah, I think this is a good example, which can actually help us to understand this objective truth and the subjective truth. Uh, so I've come across atheists offline and also online, and sometimes it has been a fruitful discussion, and sometimes it has not gone well, uh, because the arguments it comes to the intellectual, then you have to prove with good arguments. The atheist thinks that he has to prove good arguments. But and also I saw your videos on YouTube, and you also have come across many atheists, and you have discussed your beliefs and convictions with them. So in your experience, how to present your theistic beliefs to atheists?
In my experience, I think the best way to do it is to do it in a context of a positive relationship, where you're interacting with the other person as a friend, you're honoring them, you're treating them as intrinsically valuable, as someone who's in the image of God. You're not treating them as a project or just a means to your own goals. If you treat somebody as a means to your own goals, they'll feel that, and it can make them feel minimized. And oftentimes they'll be a mirror of that to you. So then they'll treat you in the way that they feel like you're treating them. And so you can feel that energy can be negative, or it can be positive. Sometimes what happens when there isn't that context of relationship is, if somebody doesn't know who I am and they're accustomed to a kind of battle frame where people are just kind of trying to put each other down, then if they come into contact with me, they might start in that kind of a battle frame. And sometimes I kind of like to, it's like a sport. We can go ahead and battle it out, the battle of ideas. There's a place for that. But what I find is way more effective in the long term is to move out of that battle frame and to come into a place of really seeking truth together, really seeing his points or her points as avenues for me to get more insight. Even if I disagree with them, it's very helpful. It's good information for me to see how somebody might think about something. That gives me information. That's a treasure to me. And then I can interact with that. So I would say that really is number one. I mean, to treat people as treasures, to value them. And even when you're treating them as a treasure, you're not treating them as a treasure in order to manipulate them, because people can feel that too. It's not like you're loving them in order so that now you can convince them. It's that you're just treating them as a valuable person. And I think that that's really the best kind of conversation in my experience. That leads to productive conversation, builds the relationship, and I think it also gives God the most opportunity to speak in the ways that God wants to. Because I think sometimes if we represent God to somebody, but we're doing it kind of in our own terms, maybe even for our own glory, sometimes we will represent things that maybe God wouldn't be speaking to that other person. If truth is a set of keys, there's many truths to unlock many doors, and not everybody needs every key at every time. And I don't have all the keys, and so maybe God has a key for somebody and he wants to release that key to them. And maybe it's a key that will encourage them with their life. Maybe they're feeling discouraged, and I might not be able to give them that key if I'm really busy trying to prove to them that their particular theory of cause and effect is irrational or something like this. Like, you're irrational because of this, and then I might miss offering something that will actually be valuable to them. And I might miss receiving a key from them. God speaks to all of us in different ways, and he can speak to people who don't even believe in God. God has spoken to me through friends who they're not at this place of believing in God, but God has released insight. Oftentimes it's about kind of God's heart and what God likes, but sometimes it's even just philosophical. It's like, oh, that's a nice little angle that helps me. Thank you for helping me to see that. So yeah, I definitely think the relationship part is key. It's foundational.
Yeah, absolutely. That, as you mentioned, that let's not impose our beliefs or arguments on them, but let's have a good, discussion over that and to progress. The ultimate goal is to progress. I remember someone
Yes,
said like this, that aim of the argument is not a victory but a progress.
a progress. Yes.
Yeah. So we both must learn, and we both must question our beliefs and convictions, right?
Yeah. And clarity is often a good way of making progress,
Yeah.
because how do you measure progress? This is one of the questions I've asked myself earlier I started doing some interviews like this, and I would have these discussions with people. And one of the questions that I had is, what's my goal in the discussion? And it was through those discussions that I actually came up with a goal that's very useful, is to seek clarity, because that's a goal that's achievable, and it's a goal that we can achieve together without one person winning and the other person losing. Together we can make progress toward clarifying the issues, clarifying what's at stake, clarifying the arguments. So I think that's a good goal in a one-on-one. Now, if you're writing a presentation, maybe you're writing a book or an article, I think you can have a goal of just making a case for your position that you think will serve your audience. That can be your goal. And it's not that you can't have that same goal in a one-on-one, but in a one-on-one, oftentimes there's a kind of competition going on. And so you want to be able to set up that competition in such a way that you can both win. And clarity is a good way of both winning, I think.
Yeah. So the ultimate goal is the progress, but progress should come with clarity,
Yes.
right? From both
Towards
sides.
clarity. That's one way of making progress, I think. Yes.
Yeah,
Toward
absolutely.
clarifying the issues. And that's not the only goal. I mean, somebody might set their goal. The progress is to, um, maybe it is to personally expand one's own view about something, or to change one's own mind, or maybe even change the other person's mind. I mean, there are many different goals one can have, and one can make progress along many different lines. Clarity is just a nice particular goal, I think, that everybody can do pretty easily. So that's one that I like, but it's not the only one.
Yeah, I got you. So, moving on to this, the book you have written on, as a philosopher, you have written a book on reasoning, how reason can lead to God. So, can you
Mhm.
just tell us about your this book in a nutshell? What is inside the book?
Yeah, so this book is a bridge. I describe a bridge of reason with steps. And these steps start with basic observations about existence and then lead to this treasure at the end of the bridge. And the treasure is about the nature of ultimate reality. And so, just to give a kind of brief sketch, it starts with the step that something exists. And I also invite readers to consider, how do you know something exists? And ultimately, I think it is by awareness. I talked about awareness earlier, that you have this awareness of consciousness, awareness of your thoughts, awareness of existence. I don't say anything about the nature of existence there in the first step, just that there's something. And I kind of tease my readers, if you deny that anything exists, well, then your denial exists, right? So it's kind of self-defeating to deny existence. Maybe everything's an illusion, but then illusions exist. Okay, so
Correct.
there's something, whether it's an illusion or not, there's something. And then I go from there to consider, well, how can there be existence? And I point to this puzzle of existence. It's like, well, whatever there is, there's there's the whole of all of reality. If there's something, then there's the whole of all of it. But it's kind of puzzling to understand how there can, what explains like why there is existence. Why is there this whole of reality? It's not like something outside of reality could produce all of reality, because anything outside of reality would not be real. The only real things are part of reality, right? So the whole of reality can't be produced by something that's not real outside of reality. So then how explains the whole? And I end up arguing that in order for there to be a reality, there has to be a kind of fundamental layer of reality, or a foundation of reality, that exists in a robust way. It doesn't exist because of some prior causes or explanations. It's the ultimate explanation that anchors the rest of reality. And then furthermore, I make the argument, well, I have a series of chapters designed to investigate the properties of this fundamental reality. I have a chapter on the foundation of matter. Somehow this fundamental reality is the foundation of matter. Chapter on the foundation of mind. Well, somehow it has the resources to make minds. This is the topic of my current work on the nature of consciousness. And the foundation of reason somehow has the resources to anchor reasoning. And so you start to uncover, okay, well, it's got powers, it's got the resources for being a causal chain leading to reasoning, beings who can reflect and think. Same with morality. It's a foundation of right and wrong, foundation of conscience. It's the foundation of all these things. And then I'm building step by step. So I'm not trying to skip ahead, but in the end, I seek to uncover the sort of deepest account of this foundation, to understand how it could be a foundation of mind, matter, morals, reasoning, how it could be that kind of a thing. And I make the argument that in order to avoid inexplicable, arbitrary limits, we shave off arbitrary, inexplicable limits, and we come up with the simplest account of its basic nature. And I end up making the argument that it would have a supreme nature to account for all the other elements within it, as well as the effects that come from it. So that's kind of a sketch. That's a sketch of the book.
Wow, that's pretty interesting to know that that's really a good book. So you have started with something, and something that leads to God, ultimate reality. So those
Mm-hmm.
who wants to read this book is available online. You can find the link in the description box. And so, sir, moving on to this last question, that what advice would you give to the young Christians, those who are in this internet age, where other philosophies, other cultures, are being are open, and the youngsters like me, as I shared earlier, that I also got influenced by other worldviews. So, how to maintain that your faith and other worldviews, how to maintain the balance?
Yeah. So I think it's really important to really try to understand things for yourself. It's easy to borrow somebody else's beliefs. It's easy to borrow somebody else's viewpoint if you trust them. But to do the work of really turning it over in your mind, looking at the articles, looking at the observations, see if you can see it for yourself, I think is really important. I think that'll make you more powerful. I think it'll also give you more reassurance, because what I find is I get a lot of questions from people who are maybe anxious about their worldview. They're feeling sort of insecure about certain things. And it feels like there's all these experts who disagree. And I find that the more that they can be empowered in their own seeing, the more they don't feel like controversies have to be resolved by the experts for they themselves to make headway in their own understanding. Now, you might look to experts to give you sort of a handle of where to look, or to kind of how to get going, but really to make it a priority to really investigate things for yourself. Something else I was going to mention when we talked about how reason can lead to God is that the title of the book has the word can in there, can lead to God. And I did that on purpose because I really want to respect different people's journeys. So I think from my own perspective that I can see a pathway of reason that leads me to think that God is real. But I also realize that people have different experiences. They're in different places. And so I want to really respect that. I want to really respect and honor the sort of differences that people are having. And I think that one way that we can all make each other stronger is through connection. And having, for Christians, I would say, be part of a spiritual community. Don't get lost. Don't get isolated on the internet. Get off the internet. Go run, but connect with actual people in the flesh. I mentioned running. This was the third thought that I had, which I don't think you would be expecting me to say as a bit of advice, but I found it very helpful myself, is that our minds and our bodies are not disconnected. So if we want to be powerful in our own thinking, it does make a difference to exercise. And so one of the things that I've done is I've gotten to a routine of every day, I at least run around the block. My block is short. It doesn't take very long to run around, but I make sure that it's a minimum goal because then I'll reach that goal. If I have too much of a goal, I won't do the exercise. But I have to tell you, just that little bit that I do that run, I'm often thinking about ideas. My mind is sorting through things and is building up my body. And so I think that a lot of times people get a feeling of depression and anxiety if they're on the internet too much. I think one of the solutions is to get off the internet, go run, go exercise, and go connect with people in the flesh, physically. And I think that's a very healthy thing. So those would be my bits of advice. And especially going back to that first one, I want to just end on that again, just really seeing things for yourself. And if you feel like you're not qualified to see it for yourself, that's okay. Everybody feels that way. Okay. Everybody feels like there's more to know. But if you actually make it a goal, a priority to seek things for yourself, that will make you more powerful at seeing the things I think that are most relevant to your own journey. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, I think that this is a worth taking advice. As you said, that get off the internet first and start communicating with the real people and have
Yes.
fellowship with, as Christians, meet with fellow believers and have conversation. If you have any doubts and question, you can just discuss and investigate by yourself, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So thank you for this wonderful advice. And also I would like to end here with I had really had a good conversation with you, Dr. Joshua, and I hope you also had the same
Yes.
experience with me. And I look forward to more conversation with you. And it is really a joy. And I really want to thank you once again for being on the podcast.
Well, thank you so much. And I just want to also just likewise say it's an honor to be connected to you and to your work. You were telling me before the show about the vision that you have for your work. It's just very beautiful, the way that you can encourage people and inspire them in their journeys. So I just want to commend you for that. And thank you again for having me on.
Yeah, welcome, sir.